Hello and welcome to episode 86 of Question and Answer. And as usual, I am your host, Panyo Basa. And I think if everything goes according to plan, if there's no sudden disasters striking, this video should go up on Easter Sunday, which, as we all know, is celebrating the day that Jesus of Nazareth allegedly arose from the dead. And so many of you will no doubt be celebrating this profound event by eating jelly beans and those orange marshmallow peanut things and candy corn and like rabbits and little baby chickens made out of chocolate and so forth. And so if you're watching this and celebrating in the manner I just described, try not to make loud smacking noises while you're eating this stuff, just in case anybody sitting next to you actually wants to hear what I'm saying. And with that, as an introduction, I'll just wade right into these questions because we got quite a few. We got more than 30 questions this time. And I'm sipping on a glass of bovine glandular secretions. And the first question is from Lieberlam. And Lieberlam says, are there any conventions of truth that are not swept away in the three aspects of existence? I have spoken to several people who view certain conventions of truth like there is nothing for enlightenment to happen to be binding. I request that the Majamaka hat be worn for the heck of it. Well, this isn't really a Majamaka question, but I'm willing to toss a bone to Lieberlam here. Let's see, got it. This is a nice hat, I got to admit. Very well made. There it is. Gotta have the tassel properly arranged or it ruins everything. Okay. So, are there any questions of truth that are not swept away in the three aspects of existence, or the three marks of existence, or the tilakkhana, which is impermanence or inconstancy, unease or suffering, dukkha, and no self? And I'm not sure if the purpose of these three marks is to sweep away conventional truths, although really, in a sense, you can say that dependent co-arising, the Buddhist theory of everything, sweeps away all conventions. So, let's see, no self, I guess, comes closest. But, yeah, I mean, all of them kind of have, all of the three marks do have some relation to the three, or to dependent co-arising, or paticca samuppada. So, are there any conventions of truth that are not swept away in the three aspects of existence? No, I mean, all conventional truths would be swept away when you get to the level of paramattha, or the ultimate. So you get rid of conventional reality and conventional truths go along with it. I mean, just any kind of statement is itself, it's invalid. I mean, you could have something like 1 equals 1, but then the question is like 1 what equals 1 what? I mean, you're just dealing with abstractions that aren't applying to reality in general. So then, I mean, I actually went through a kind of existential crisis when I was a young monk. I went into a deep depression caused by the fact that there was nothing I could not doubt. And I'm just trying desperately to come up with some statement that I could not doubt. And this was like the means of enlightenment, allegedly, for a person who calls himself Jed McKenna. I mean, that is his method for becoming enlightened, is just try to come up with a statement that you cannot possibly doubt, and eventually you fail. And the best I could do is the universe is the universe, which is essentially everything is everything. Whatever exists is whatever exists, which is such a tautology that is pretty much meaningless. A equals A. So I really don't think that there are any conventions of truth that are going to survive just an all-out attack of Buddhist philosophy. So you can say there is nobody for enlightenment to happen to. Um, yeah, I mean, the thing is, I mean, once you get to a certain level, then symbolic statements that are, assume the form of sentences just become invalid. It's kind of hard to explain because this is the very first question. It's like, generally, I need a few questions to get some momentum going, to really get in the groove, and to have the very first question be something like this. It's a little daunting, even with the fez on. But I mean, just the simple answer is no. There aren't any conventions of truth that are not swept away in the three aspects of existence, and might as well throw in dependent co-arising or dependent or paticca samuppada. Because, I mean, he says here, Lieberlam says, I have spoken to several people who view certain conventions of truth, like there is nobody for enlightenment to happen to be binding. Well, I mean, they're binding within a samsaric context, and these people presumably are thoroughly enmeshed in the samsaric context, so of course, they would consider them to be just totally binding. But once you transcend samsara and a samsaric context, you transcend these conventional truths. So I guess I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to Lieberlam's next question here, which is another kind of tricky one. He says, practically speaking, what does it mean to withdraw from everything that has an inherent nature? And then in brackets, he's got certified Madhyamaka question. But, I mean, practically speaking, what does it mean to withdraw from everything that has an inherent nature? Nothing has an inherent nature. So it doesn't mean anything. And maybe he just kind of put in a typo where maybe he was trying to say, what does it mean to withdraw from everything that does not have an inherent nature? Because there isn't anything that has an inherent nature according to Buddhist philosophy, and especially Madhyamaka philosophy. I mean, if you want to go with Abhidhamma, Orthodox Theravada, Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition, then the only thing that has an inherent nature would be these dhammas that exist for like a trillionth of an eye blink, and they're just like a pure elemental essence, like masculinity and femininity. According to Orthodox Theravada and Abhidhamma philosophy, they are ultimate realities. And there's only two of them, masculine and feminine. Or, like nose sensitivity, or water element, or fire element, things like that. According to Abhidhamma philosophy, they have an inherent nature. But I don't know how you would withdraw from everything. I mean, it would seem to involve just absolute extinction, not even enlightenment, because according to Abhidhamma, Nibbana also is one of these ultimate essences. So, what does it mean to withdraw from everything that has an inherent nature? I mean, from the point of view that nothing has an inherent nature, it doesn't mean anything. But if you accept, like Abhidhamma philosophy that says, everything is composed of these elements that, of course, have an inherent nature, even though they might exist for only a trillionth of an eye blink, to withdraw from all of that would just mean utter annihilation. It wouldn't even mean, a transcendence into Nibbana, because Nibbana is just on the list of these same things as masculinity and tongue sensitivity. So it's kind of a trick question, I think. Maybe Lieberlam tricked himself by asking it. Because if nothing has an inherent nature, you cannot withdraw from everything that has an inherent nature, because we're already withdrawn in a sense, because there isn't anything that has an inherent nature. So, gosh. Yeah, I mean, it would just mean, if you accept that anything has an inherent nature, then it would mean like extinction, just total annihilation. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is not a Madhyamaka question. So I'll take the fez off. I may put it back on just for jollies later on, or out of respect for a certain guru, but we'll see. So the next question is from EU Diva, and EU Diva says, if I translate Sutta Pitaka's all 5 suttas perfectly and accurately into my mother tongue that is spoken by 10 million people at the moment, how much of dana am I looking at? Well, I mean, first of all, there's way more than 5 suttas. Maybe she means the 5 Nikayas. And to translate something perfectly and accurately, I don't know if it's possible to translate anything into a different language perfectly. Yeah, I don't know if that's even possible. But let's say it just means like very skillfully. How much dana? And I don't think you're looking at any dana really. I mean, if you're going to sell the books, then that's not dana, because dana is like generous giving. It's not just, buying a commodity. So it would depend on how generous the 10 million people who speak your mother tongue are, that are just going to make donations to you for having made such an excellent translation. Because that's what dana is. Dana is just generosity or just giving. It's not, paying for something. So, yeah, you would know that better than I do. Probably most of those 10 million would not be interested in Buddhist translations anyway, even if they were free. So, yeah, I think this might be a kind of a joke question anyway. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, how angry do you get? And then in parentheses is before and after disrobing. And then another question that's part of the same question, I guess, is what do you do at the moment when you are angry? So I guess it's 2 questions. I'll just separate these. That adds up to 3, which is allowable. It's not transgressive, even though he's got 1 question with 3 question marks, but I don't think he has committed any grave offense by doing that. So how angry do I get? I mean, I guess you'd use a numerical scale, with 0 being completely chill, not angry at all, and 10 being just red-faced and bellowing in rage, screaming and like punching walls and stuff. And it is ironic that the angriest I can ever remember being was when I was a monk. But at the same time, I was mindful to some degree while I was bellowing in rage. The closest I've ever been to that as a layperson has been when a certain female has just completely pushed my buttons until I'm at wit's end. And then I've done a little bit of bellowing then too. So, yeah, I mean, there have been a few times in my life when I've gotten up into the 9 or 10 range, both when I was and was not a monk. I remember, I've told this story before, but I spent a while at a place in Burma called Thabet Ain Doya. And it was in a forest. It was supposedly a forest monastery, but it was just being raped to death by the local villagers. East Asians in general, or Southeast Asians, as a general rule, they do not have much of an affinity for nature. They don't care about nature to the same extent that Americans do, for example. They don't go out camping in the woods for fun, that kind of a thing. The woods are scary. There's dangerous stuff out there. So, anyways, I was staying at this place that was being raped to death by villagers, and I come back from alms round, and I'm hearing chopping coming from the tree where I was staying in this forest. So I'm hurrying up the trail. I've already been fuming because, I was, in my earlier days, I was like a tree-hugging nature conservationist, and still am to some degree. And just hearing chopping all day long. It's like, I'd just be sitting there just grumbling sometimes. And as I'm going back to my place where my tree is, I'm having to step over chopped wood that this guy's already chopped. And I get there, and he's right up above where I usually stay, and I just yell at him. And mainly, at first, I'm yelling just because he's off in the distance. It's just so my voice will carry to where he is. I'm saying, "Don't chop wood here," and he just keeps calling back, "I'm cutting dry wood," which may have been true at that moment, but the wood that I had to step over to get to where I was not dry wood. He was chopping green trees. And finally, like after the third or fourth time, something just kind of snaps and I just bellow at him, just don't cut wood here, get out. And my arm is like going like this. And I've told this story before. Those of you who watch these Q&As have heard this story before, but I'm like going like this with my finger while I'm yelling. And there's this part of my mind that is just sort of surprised or intrigued or mildly interested in this. It's like, I wasn't planning on doing that with my arm and my finger. That's odd. At the same time that I'm bellowing, at the same time, there's this totally calm, detached, observational mode going on. Or another time when I was living in a cave in Burma, the main thing that was getting to me living in Burma, there's a lot of things, but the weather in central Burma is it's like a furnace. And sometimes the rainy season is just like a second hot season. It's a drought. The crops fail at least 1 out of every 3 years on average to subsistence farmers in central Burma that don't have irrigation, and most of them don't. So I just at one point I just snapped, and I'm just like cussing and yelling and slamming things. And I've told this story several times before also, where at that moment it was like this split happened in my personality where there's a part of me that's just observing me throwing a conniption. There's like the version of me throwing the conniption, yelling and cussing and slamming things. And then it just caused like this detachment while this other part is just observing. So that in a way, it was like I was an actor playing the role of somebody throwing a conniption. While at the same time, you're not identified with the role entirely. There's like this deeper identification with, the person who isn't the role, And so I've told a friend of mine who was a Mahasi Arya, Mahasi Sodapana, that, I have thrown conniptions with mindfulness. You're mindfully observing just the yelling and everything going on is just this weird phenomenon. It's like a lightning storm or something. And he didn't believe me at all. He just couldn't see it. But I experienced it. So I know what I'm talking about there. So how angry do I get? Yeah, a few times, definitely in single digits. I've bellowed in rage. And I think at least half the time it has been when I was a monk. But the thing is, if you're not like an angry person in general, it's just, you're not in the habit of getting angry a lot, then when it does arise, and if you're at the same time, you're in the habit of being mindful, it's just really easy to be mindful because it's like all of a sudden like sirens and bright lights are going off, and it just draws your attention to it. It's like, you pay attention to that because it's like this unusual thing that's happening, and it's just easier to be mindful, strangely, ironically, if you're throwing a conniption. But for the most part, my sweetheart hasn't been really pushing my buttons for quite a while. And so mainly if I get angry, I get angry when I'm driving, just irritated, like annoyed. South Carolina has, I think it's like a statistical fact that South Carolina has the worst drivers in America. Like the insurance rates are higher. There's more insurance claims and accidents and so forth in South Carolina. And that's just obvious. Like, for example, and I've said most of this stuff before, but about half the people on the roads around here do not use turn signals. They just don't use them. It's just not the tradition. I've had it tried. Some person tried to explain to me once that there's actually a shortage of blinker fluid in this area. But they could drill for that easy. I don't see why. It could be destroying the environment or something, drilling for blinker fluid, but there's got to be some way around that problem. But anyways, getting back to what I was talking about, I'm just like, sometimes, driving, it's like pretty much every time I drive, well, anytime I'm driving to work in the morning anyway, or driving home afterwards sometimes, it's like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, somebody just behaves like a complete idiot going 70 miles an hour on the freeway. You know, it's like, what the fuck are you doing? You know, it's like, in a way, I'm just like annoyed at this person, calling him an idiot or something. And that kind of thing can happen at work too. Not at my fellow coworkers so much as just there's like glitches and stuff going wrong, and I mess up a piece of metal, and then I've got to throw it away and like cut a new piece and this kind of thing. I can do some cussing and grumbling then. Also, I mean, this is South Carolina, so there is kind of the South Carolina work ethic where you just never in a hurry. You take it easy, spend a lot of time talking, and I want to get stuff done, and I've got to wait for somebody else, you know, to finish talking so that they can make this other piece of metal that I need in order to modify that into something else. And just standing around, just grumbling to myself, you know, frowning, scowling, that kind of a thing. That can happen. But I'm not a particularly angry person. I can be irritable. And it's like the Visuddhimagga says that of the various personality types, the person who has a dosa temperament, or like an aversion or anger temperament, can actually get enlightened more quickly than the average person, because if you're irritated easily, then samsara irritates you, and then you have less attachment to samsara and you're more willing to renounce it. So I guess I answered that question. And then the second question here is, what do you do at the moment when you're angry? And I've pretty much already explained that too. I mean, sometimes it's just sort of, you know, grumbling to myself, criticizing and finding fault, bad habit of mine. Or like if I'm driving alone, you know, I might actually be exclaiming. And it's not just at drivers who are idiots too. It's like the traffic signals in this part of South Carolina, sometimes they last forever. You can just sit there and sit there and sit there at a red light, just waiting for it to finally cycle through and turn green again. And, you know, if you're in a hurry, you got to get somewhere or whatever, that can cause irritation to arise, because of course, all suffering is caused by desire. I have the desire to get from point A to point B in a timely manner. Anything that interferes with that causes a certain amount of irritation or annoyance. So at least I'm observing it. It's relatively rare that I would get really angry in a completely oblivious, unaware state, like no mindfulness. But if it does happen, I'm not aware of it, so I can't really say. So let's see here. All right, third question of Nature Cure. Do you consider Eckhart Tolle, the lay celebrity, as enlightened being? Question mark. Truly? Question mark. Really? Question mark. Deeply? Question mark. Well, I mean, I don't really believe anything truly, really, and deeply. I mean, I'm skeptical by nature. I mean, I realize that perceptual knowledge is not 100% reliable, not 100% valid. And so there's always going to be a certain amount of skepticism lurking around the corner somewhere. But with regard to Eckhart Tolle, first of all, I've said this a number of times on these Q&As. I'm making sure that I'm recording, and it says I am. I've said a number of times on these Q&As that an enlightened being in a samsaric context might not mean anything. There might not even be the possibility of full enlightenment within a purely samsaric context. You know, in the context of this phenomenal world, I mean, there may not be any really enlightened beings. I mean, there's great sages and saints and so forth, but I think you have to transcend samsara in order to be enlightened. And I mean, the part that transcends samsara is not available to a samsaric perspective. So it's just going off the scale rather than becoming enlightened. You're just kind of no longer on the map. But even considering that, I mean, Eckhart Tolle, I read his first famous book. I've watched some of his YouTube videos. And he had some kind of awakening experience I don't think he's just a fraud. I don't think he's faking it. But it could be that he experienced something that he interprets as full enlightenment when really he's not all the way there, and I can't really say. So, if Eckhart Tolle is a fully enlightened being, then of course Orthodox Theravada is mistaken in its assumption that you can't be fully enlightened for more than about 24 hours without dying unless you are ordained as a Theravada Buddhist monastic. And I kind of don't really believe that anyway. Just other Buddhist things like Eckhart Tolle's, he's still living a worldly life. I think he's married. Maybe he's not celibate. So all these things would go against a traditional interpretation of enlightenment as some sort of renunciant sage who is also a saint and does not care at all about sensuality and so forth. But I'm open-minded with regard to that. So I consider it possible that Eckhart Tolle is an enlightened being. But if that's the case, then yeah, I mean, an enlightened being isn't necessarily what the texts say an enlightened being is. But I mean, I've never made up my mind one way or the other about someone like Eckhart Tolle. Or, Paul Lowe, he's another one of those. Osho, I'd be more skeptical towards Osho, but a lot of people consider Osho to have been fully enlightened, also known as the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. There's lots and lots of them out there. Andrew Cohen, I think is the name of one of them, who was a big deal back in the late 80s, early 90s. There's a bunch of them. Adyashanti, Jed McKenna that I already mentioned. There's a lot of these lay people who are claiming to be enlightened. But I think probably most of them really are frauds. There's Daniel Ingram is another one. I think a lot of them just might be, some of them are like charlatans. And probably some of them have attained something. They've had some sort of breakthrough in their meditation, which they may then interpret as enlightenment, because that's really easy. That happens a lot in Burma, for example. You're meditating and you have some sort of real spectacular experience in meditation. And so it's very easy to just grasp onto the idea, wow, I've really attained something. I'm an Arya now, that kind of a thing. But in Eckhart Tolle's case, I really can't say for sure. I think he has attained something, but whether you can call that full enlightenment or not, I really don't know. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is going to be another I don't know question, I think. This is from Thur. I don't know why I tried to pronounce it Thur. I've never done that before. Thur. This is from Thur. And he says, are you aware of the great Majjhimaka system of the Tibetan master Dolpopa? And if so, what are your thoughts on it? And I'm not even going to, this doesn't even warrant me putting on the Majjhimaka fez, because I really don't know anything about the Tibetan master Dolpopa. I think I've read, I've read mentions of him, but I know essentially nothing about the system, so I don't really have any thoughts on the great Majjhimaka system of the Tibetan master Dolpopa. I really have not gotten into Tibetan Buddhism much. It never really resonated with me. I never really was drawn to Tibetan Buddhism. The Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation is one of the most profound books I've ever read. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is interesting. But I've also read the autobiography of Milarepa, which is fascinating. So I've read a few Tibetan things, but not very much. And it's just really not my bag of tea. So yeah, I'm ignorant of Dolpopa. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, with regard to the previous Q&A, he says, you said at 23 minutes and 33 seconds into the video, quote, regret or remorse is always bad karma. It always makes things worse, unquote. And then he says, my question is, could you please elaborate more on this statement? For example, what if a person committed an unquestionable evil deed with the intention to hurt and enjoyed it and took great pleasure and delight in making other people suffer? If that person is unapologetically arrogant about their deeds, how does this attitude help them? In your opinion, what is the right course of action for such a person? Well, I mean, this hypothetical situation here is just, it's not a good argument. It is a false dichotomy. It's pretty obvious to me, and it should be pretty obvious to some of you, maybe even most of you, that experiencing remorse on the one hand and being unapologetically arrogant on the other are not the only two options. I mean, there's an infinite number of options. I mean, you don't have to just pick between remorse and being unapologetically arrogant. Remorse, from the Buddhist point of view, is kukucha, and that's always bad karma. It is always an unwholesome mental state. But being arrogant also is also discouraged in Buddhism. So you shouldn't choose either one of these options. So, I mean, he gives a really extreme example. Somebody commits an unquestionable evil deed with the intention to hurt and enjoyed it and took great pleasure and delight in making other people suffer. I mean, if they do that, then they may be just a lost cause. You know, that's like a Clockwork Orange kind of stuff. And the right course of action for such a person, just get arrested, go to prison. Just, remove yourself from society where you delight in hurting other people. But I mean, with regard to an ordinary case of somebody doing something wrong, somebody doing something unethical that causes, an increase in suffering in the environment, then, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with acknowledging what you did and then trying to do better in future, trying to rectify what you did to some degree, as much as is realistic. And then just, you fall down, you just get back up and continue moving forward. You acknowledge that, it would have been better if you hadn't done that what you did was unethical or whatever. And then you just resolve to try to do better in future. It's like you make a mistake with regard to anything. I mean, and acting unethically really is kind of a mistake. It's like some people will argue that people will just do what is wrong. They know that it's wrong and they'll just do it, even they know that it's wrong. But in a way it's not entirely true. I mean, people do wrong because they are ignorant and just don't know that doing that really is, it's harmful to themselves. It's harmful to everybody involved. So, I mean, there's the example of, there's the woman at the dollar store who will look around before slapping their kid to make sure nobody sees them slap their kid because, they know they shouldn't be slapping their kid. And so they're making sure nobody else is seeing them do it. But still, I mean, they're still ignorant people. And they're just, it's sort of like, they just don't want to get in trouble. It's not so much that they think that it's wrong as they just don't want to catch hell for it. So, I don't know why I started on that though. See, how did that relate to this question here? Just doing something wrong. You do something wrong, I mean, it's like making a mistake. And in a way, it is. It is making a mistake in judgment or whatever. And so, I mean, any kind of mistake you make, you acknowledge you made the mistake, and then you try not to make the same mistake. I mean, it doesn't require remorse. It doesn't require beating yourself up over it. It doesn't require regret. You just acknowledge, well, I made a mistake there. I'm going to try and do better next time. Try to avoid making that same mistake. That's all you got to do. So, I guess I'll just move on to the next question here. And I'm getting hit towards the beginning of this Q&A by a lot of questions I just do not know the answer to. For example, here's a question from Mooners. What do you think of the Mises Institute? They offer hundreds of free resources on economics and including PDFs and audiobooks in the tradition of the Austrian School of Economics. Well, I've never been interested at all in economics. So possibly the only economics books I've ever read in my life, one was The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. On the back of the book, it did say economics on the little label. So I guess that was an economics book, but it wasn't so much about economics as just about just weird anthropological stuff, like why the Pope wears a funny hat, why some people think it's real important to know what kind of wine goes with lamb, or how to eat a banana in public, that kind of thing. And then there was another book I read. It was Amartya Sen. I think he won a Nobel Prize in economics. It was like the idea of justice. And I mean, that book kind of sucked, actually. It wasn't so much an economic, it was kind of an economics book. And as an economist, economists in general seem to equate material prosperity with happiness. You know, they seem to have this equation. You know, if they're going for the happiness of a society, they want that society to be economically prosperous. And it just doesn't work that way. So, yeah, I really just do not have much interest in economics. So, I mean, I've heard about Mises, and I probably have even heard about the Mises Institute, but I just am not interested. I'm interested in lots of things, but economics generally is not one of them. I do know that capitalism works better than socialism, though. I mean, that's more of a historical thing than an economic thing. You just look at history and see for yourself. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Austin. And I don't know if this question, I think this exact question was asked like a month ago. Maybe not by Austin, but I mean, it seems like word for word, pretty much identical to a question that was asked not very long ago, which is as follows. Was there ever a time when you were a monk when all doubt about the Buddha's teaching subsided? And I remember the last time I answered this question, it was like, well, when I was sound asleep, there was no doubts. You know, when you're meditating, there's no doubts. And most of the time, when you're going about your business, there isn't any doubt about the Buddha's teaching. And so there is that. I mean, most of the time I had no doubts about the Buddha's teaching because I just wasn't thinking in that way. You know, I'm thinking about building this fire or reading this book or, you know, observing my breath or whatever it is that I was doing. And I'm not like wondering if the Buddhist teaching is 100% legit. But the thing is, I mean, in order to have doubt about the Buddhist teaching, I mean, you have to know exactly what the Buddhist teaching is. You know, it's like, I mean, you can't really know. You can't know for sure what exactly the Buddha did and did not teach. So there's always going to be a certain amount of skepticism or just suspension of judgment. Skepticism in the classical sense of suspending judgment. But whether you call that doubt or not, yeah, I guess there'd be doubt in there. You know, I doubt that the Buddha really taught, you know, such and such. I doubt that the Buddha really taught the 12 Nidana theory of dependent co-arising, for example. Seriously doubt that he taught Abhidhamma. So, was there ever a time when you were a monk when all doubt about the Buddha's teaching subsided? I mean, it depends. I mean, how do you even interpret the question? I was having difficult the last time I tried answering this question because, you know, there's different layers to it. But, you know, I don't have any doubt that the Buddha was extremely wise. And there's something like the Atthakavagga that I consider to be, you know, one of the oldest, the most archaic examples of primitive Buddhism, you know, like very early Buddhism, pre-Theravadan Buddhism. You know, there's some statements even in that, I mean, you could say, well, I mean, that's just sort of like a generalization, that there could be exceptions to that generalization and so forth. I don't consider anything in the form of sentences to be absolute truth. So it's just part of my character that there's always going to be a certain suspension of judgment and a certain lack of certainty with regard to the validity of sentences. But, yeah, so in a way, this is kind of a trick question. And it was the last time I answered this question too, where it's really hard to answer it because, I don't even know exactly what the Buddha taught. He lived 2,500 years ago. And most of what he was teaching wasn't even written down until hundreds of years later. There's obviously been a lot of changes and additions and so forth. So, first of all, you'd have to know what the Buddha's teaching is before you could have doubts about whether it's true or not. So, there's just these obstacles in the way of absolute certainty, obstacles in the way of me, whereas a lot of people, being human, it's just sort of human nature that you're going to just have unquestioning faith in something. It could be a religion, it could be a political party, it could just be in your own family or clan or whatever. You just believe, your side is the good side. And I just don't function that way. So yeah, there have been lots of times when I didn't have any doubts about the Buddha's teaching, mainly because I just wasn't thinking about the Buddha's teaching. Or I was thinking about some aspect of the Buddha's teaching that I really accept. But I don't think there was ever a time when I believed Abhidhamma, for example, or certain other doctrines that you'll find in the texts. So I guess I answered that question well enough, I hope. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mo, Mo asked a question before, and it turns out that Mo is actually a dog. So Mo says, me and my master, and then friend in parentheses, meditate frequently, practice compassion, and I'm hardly aggressive. Is this going to be great benefit in my future life? Well, if you meditate correctly, then that's definitely going to be helpful. If you don't meditate, you just go into like a trance, you just like hypnotize yourself. That can at least, give you some karmic momentum in a direction that isn't entirely pernicious. Practicing compassion. I'm not exactly sure what the practicing of it means, but feeling compassion is definitely benevolent and, it's wholesome karma. But being hardly aggressive, that's not necessarily good or bad. Some animals are hardly aggressive just because it's just their nature not to be aggressive. And, they're not going to be skyrocketing into a heaven realm after they die just because they were a rabbit that wasn't aggressive. It's like, it reminds me of the saying by Jordan Peterson, you should be able to be a monster and then not be one. So if you're able to be a monster and you're still not aggressive, then that involves a certain self-restraint and a certain amount of self-observation and wisdom and so forth. But if you're not able to be a monster, then you don't get any bonus points for not being one because you just couldn't be one even if you wanted to. And I've got a dog loudly snoring behind me. Yeah, you guys are snoring. Okay then. So, being hardly aggressive, it's good not to be like violent, but just because you're not aggressive doesn't necessarily mean that you're earning merit for not being aggressive, because you could just be, well, I won't accuse Mo of this, but some people, they're just timid and, they're just timid and passive. And so it's, in a way, their motives for not being aggressive are unskillful motives. So just not being aggressive in and of itself is not necessarily good karma. But meditating frequently, especially if it's a kind of effective meditation technique, and also experiencing compassion is good. So it should benefit anyone in their future life if they practice meditation and experience compassion. So Mo's next question here is, my friend says he got into Buddhism because he thought about me and him being more equal than people thought him. What was the click? That was the click he needed. Can that happen? I think that he was just too high at that time. Maybe the dog is high too. It's possible. But let's see. Yeah, I mean, let's see. Let's consider this. So a person got into Buddhism because he considered himself and his dog to be more equal than people considered people and dogs to be. And that was the click he needed. Can this happen? Yeah, I'm sure it can. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can happen. And yeah, I mean, in a way, it's not what caused me to become a Buddhist, but it certainly is an aspect of Buddhism that resonates with me, is the idea that, you know, people, they might be at a higher level of like psychic development than the average animal. But still, I mean, when I'm with animals, especially animals that I like, you know, I've been the brother of many boy dogs. You know, I bond with boy dogs better than with girl ones as a general rule. And yeah, some of my best friends have been dogs, and I just consider them to be, you know, in a sense, they are equals. You know, they're equally worthy of consideration, and, you know, you shouldn't kick a dog any more than you should kick me, for example. You know, so in some senses we are equal, and that's endorsed in Buddhism. And if that's what really called a person to Buddhism, then that's as valid as any other reason, I think. So yeah, whether he was high or not could be irrelevant in this case. So yeah, I think that'll work. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. To coin a verb, do you really think one could goinka one's way to awakening? Isn't meditation without right view tantamount to expecting oranges from an apple tree? Well, right view, yeah, there's different levels of right view, and ultimately, right view is not intellectual and it's not perceptual. So, I mean, it is possible that you don't have any real metaphysical philosophy, any profound ethical philosophy. You're just drawn to being contemplative and just being in the present moment, you know, being as wide awake as you can manage. Then your wisdom is going to progress, even though you may not know anything about Buddhism. It is possible that some people are just ripe. You know, it's like St. John of the Cross. I keep bringing him up, that he's probably my favorite Christian, and he may have been a fully enlightened being, you know, assuming that fully enlightened beings can exist in a samsaric context. And yeah, I mean, he wasn't a Buddhist. He was a Roman Catholic. He revered the Virgin Mary. He went into ecstasies upon taking communion. And the Song of Songs was his favorite part of the Bible. So really, I think, I mean, you have to transcend all intellectual points of view, that you can make progress in spite of a limiting religious, what do you call it, the worldview. You know, you're stuck in a religion that really doesn't even have, it doesn't have room in the system for even the concept of full enlightenment, which is probably most religious systems today. Then, I mean, you can still make progress, and then just in spite of the system, you can just have a click, you can just experience a flash of liberating insight that'll just cause you to transcend all this intellectual noise anyway. It just becomes irrelevant. So, yeah, I think it has happened that someone has goinked their way to awakening. And by goinking one's way to awakening is mainly just meditating, you know, being in the present moment without really having a sophisticated metaphysical philosophy or an intellectual system that kind of guides you in your practice. That it is, I mean, having Buddhist philosophy guiding you in your practice can make your practice more effective. It may help you, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. So I guess it's possible. And I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question here, which is a simpler one that you probably haven't been asked. I'll just read the question. A simpler one that you probably have been asked numerous times. Did you have a precise roadmap for disrobing, or did you just throw yourself willingly into the maw of destiny, ready to accept whatever came your way? Well, it was kind of a combination of both. I mean, I knew I was going to be moving to South Carolina, where I was going to receive help in getting set up in an apartment. I mean, I was going to be paying for it, but still, just having somebody kind of scout the area, find a place that was for rent, and, use the money that was donated to me for getting started on it, that kind of a thing. That was set up for me. But I didn't know what I was going to do for a living. I didn't know what South Carolina was like. I'd never been there before. So it was sort of a combination of the two. I mean, the one time I really did just throw myself willingly into the maw of destiny was in 2011 when I came back to America, and I literally did not know where I was going to sleep. I was just burned out on Burma. I was just fed up. Most of my supporters in America that supported me before I came to Burma had just sort of faded out. Communications were awful. There was no internet or anything at the time in Burma. And so almost all of my supporters in America had just sort of, lost interest and gone their own way or whatever. And I was just kind of stranded in Burma. And so finally I just said, I'm coming back to America. I'm just doing it. And so I didn't know where I was going to sleep or anything. I just managed. Somebody donated me a plane ticket. I just let people know in advance, I'm going to be at the airport at this time. If anyone wants to pick me up, please do so. And everything worked out. I mean, it was kind of scary. I mean, really, to throw yourself into the maw of destiny, as Rui here puts it. It takes a certain amount of courage. And it is endorsed in Buddhism and in Christianity. Give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep. I mean, that's Buddhist and Christian teachings right there. And you just have to, God will provide, or Dharma will provide. You just have to have faith in the mercy of the universe. And if you do have the faith of a grain of mustard seed, it works. If you're freaked out and always trying to be in survival mode and making sure this and that will work out, then it's not going to work as well. At least at the metaphysical, the spiritual level. You're not really renouncing if you do that. So, yeah, in a way, just dropping out of the monkhood was itself kind of a great renunciation. Flinging myself into the unknown again. But in answer to Rui's question, it was like a combination of the two. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from Zeno Demon. And Zeno Demon, he's responding to a video. It might not even been a Q&A video. I think it was. I was talking in the previous Q&A about how rules and morals aren't exactly the same. That precepts and actual ethics, I mean, they have some overlap, but they're like on two different levels. So Zeno Demon says, even Jesus Christ gave expectations to stealing. I think he means exceptions. So even Jesus Christ gave exceptions to stealing, something to the line of taking bread so long as he has no jam to put on it, which I don't remember that from the Bible at all. But then he says, should then a monk not be more inclined to divine law rather than the laws of man? So, yeah, I don't fully understand this question now that I think about it. But, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, divine law, I mean, there are no decrees of a god determining what you should and shouldn't do. I mean, there is dharma, which I guess you could call divine laws, just more of a, natural law. And then there's the laws of man. And yeah, natural law would be more along the lines of genuine ethics, and the laws of man would be certain rules. Like monks have to follow both kinds. I mean, monks have to follow ethical rules and also really just social, artificial rules, like shaving your head. There's nothing immoral about not shaving your head. Monks just have to shave their head. They have to wear, sort of brownish colored robes that are cut and sewn in a certain way. Has nothing to do with morals. They're not allowed to eat in the afternoon or at night. And there's nothing inherently immoral about eating a meal in the afternoon. There's nothing more immoral about eating something at 12:30 p.m. than at 11:30 a.m. It's just, that's the rules. It's there for a different reason other than, your own ethical welfare. So, yeah, but then again, a monk, I mean, nobody forces a monk to be ordained, or ideally, sometimes it does happen. Like in Burma, a kid will just get sent to the monastery by poor parents that got too many mouths to feed. They want the prestige of having a monk in the family, so they'll just send a kid to the monastery. All the way a lot of Asian families will just force a kid to go to medical school. Asian families can be that way. So, anyways, where was I going with that? No, yeah, it's like you join the monkhood voluntarily, and so there's all these rules that, I mean, you are taking upon yourself voluntarily. So there's a rule that says you have to shave your head at least every 2 months, or 2 finger widths, whichever comes first, your head and your beard. And I mean, nobody forced you to become a monk, and those are the rules. So, I mean, it's like nobody forces you to play a game of pool, but I mean, you play by the rules because otherwise you're cheating. So, a monk, I mean, you'd have to acknowledge that genuinely ethical rules, like not lying and not stealing, are in a way more important than just, shaving your head every 2 months, at least every 2 months, or not going through a door with a bowl in your hand, that kind of a thing. But still, I mean, all of them are binding. It's just that some of them are binding for one reason and others are binding for another reason. Or for more than one reason. So, I mean, it is true that Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, he did give exceptions to following rules. Like, I don't remember him justifying stealing, but he did justify his disciples like gleaning grain on the Sabbath. They're walking through a field and picking wheat or barley or something and eating it raw. They were criticized for that because it was the Sabbath and they shouldn't be doing any work on the Sabbath. And then Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. That sometimes it is justifiable to break rules. And as a monk, sometimes it is justifiable to break rules. Like, you're better off saving a pretty girl from drowning and maybe even doing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to save her life rather than just sit there on the bank and watching her drown because monks aren't supposed to touch girls. Or one that I did personally in my life is there's a rule against a monk giving medicine to lay people unless it's their family or a monastery attendant. Your parents you can give medicine to, a monastery attendant who's sick you can give medicine to, but like lay people who are supporters out in the village, you're not supposed to be giving them medicine because it just causes people to come to the monk to get medicine rather than to hear Dhamma. And then the monk, maybe he'll give the wrong medicine because he's not, maybe he's not a trained physician, gives the wrong medicine, the person gets more sick, they die or something, the Sangha gets blamed for it. So it's just against the rules. And I was living out in the middle of the sticks, just out in the middle of nowhere. And one of my supporters said that his daughter had malaria for I can't remember if it was 6 weeks or 6 months. But it was the worst kind of malaria. It was falciparum malaria that was just endemic there. And I had state-of-the-art malaria medication. And so I figured it's better for me to break this minor rule, give him some malaria pills to give to his daughter, rather than have this girl maybe die or just be completely messed up, like with like these mini strokes that go all through your head when falciparum malaria goes cerebral, that kind of a thing. Better for me just to take the hit, give them the pills, and then she got better. I broke a rule, but the girl was, she recovered from malaria. So, yeah, I mean, ethical rules are more important than just the artificial rules of etiquette and just sort of societal propriety and so forth. But I'm not exactly sure where Zeno Demon was going with that. And I've got other questions to answer. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is from Cool Whip, also known as the Proto-Pseudo-Monk. And as I mentioned before, Cool Whip occasionally gives titles to his questions. And the title to his first question is Origin of Samsara. And so he says, craving or desire is the cause for rebirth. This gives a satisfactory explanation for the endless creation of samsara from the present moment onwards towards positive infinity. However, this doesn't explain how desire in the present originated from negative infinity. What is the explanation of the origin, the first desire that started the cycle of rebirth? Could the explanation be something like, because the essence or substance of reality or samsara is craving, like an unmanifested potential that finds a way to manifest through beings or technology? ? I think you explain this with Hegel's ideas, but still not sure I quite understand it. Well, from the Buddhist point of view, there is no first desire. That samsara is eternal, going into the past forever, or at least it's just indeterminate. So, yeah, there was no first desire causing samsara. There was no first upsurge of ignorance. It's not like the Old Testament where God is just hanging out, just chilling. And then he says, let there be light, and just starts the universe, starts the cosmos going. There had to have been angels and so forth before then, you would assume, but it just doesn't work that way in Buddhism. In Buddhism, samsara is beginningless. It's been here forever. So there is no first desire. Let's see. So the cycle of rebirth never had a start. It just keeps going because it can. And that goes back to my simile of the block of marble, that you've got this formless, sizeless block of marble that has within it every possible statue, including lots of impossible statues that are already there in that block of marble, that, every molecule is already in the correct position. They're already in there, just in a potential or virtual form, a virtual state. And infinity has always been this block of marble, and it has always contained all these virtual statues that are virtually real inside of it. And that's all the suffering, craving beings in this universe. So, let's see. He continues here. Could the explanation be something like, because the essence or substance of reality or samsara is craving, like an unmanifested potential that finds a way to manifest? That's sort of like Schopenhauer's will, isn't it? There is some of that, but that's not what causes it to be. What causes it to be is it's because it's possible. Because it's just one of the uncarved statues in the uncarved block that's virtually there. And some of them are so complex that they become self-aware and start thinking that they're separate from the rest of everything else. And I got a dog here that's wanting to get petted. Here, she wants to say hi. This is Poppy. She's like part guinea pig and part monkey. There you go. She makes these little chortling noises. She never barks. She just kind of whirs and chortles. So let's see here. Okay. I think the part that I was going to try and answer is actually part of Cool Whip's next question here. So, yeah, I'll just move on to the next question. I hope I didn't skip over anything. Let's see. Could the explanation be something like, because the essence or substance of reality or samsara is craving, like an unmanifested potential that finds a way to manifest through beings and technology. I mean, you could interpret it that way, sort of like Schopenhauer, but I mean, really, every possible thing that could possibly exist has always existed in the block of marble. Just look at it that way. That there is no beginning and no end. And there's no purpose to it either. So I'll just move on to the second question here. The purpose of samsara or nirvana. Let's see. This is the title. The purpose of samsara, nirvana, or the singularity. And refuting Hegel's dialectic. So then he says, then, if our nature is to be manifest into something, the universe is asymmetrical, and we are in Hegel's synthesis becoming, originating from pure nothingness. But how can we be sure that the evolution from pure non-being to pure being, in the end, these two converge? For example, what if the universe is optimizing a function of self-discovery on a trajectory of infinite growth through self-recursive patterns, like creating abundant galaxies, stars, life technology, consciousness, etc.? In this theory, the self-recursive, intrinsically reflective, growing pattern of self has the purpose of knowledge growth. That isn't delusion, maybe enlightenment. You could argue against Hegel's axiom that the one profound difference between pure non-being and pure being, despite them both sharing the aspect that there are no discernible qualities, in concluding they are the same, is that eventually pure being possesses the quality of the awareness of everything, whereas pure non-being is devoid of any awareness. Thus, they would be conceptually or philosophically equivalent in the realm of logic and reason, but experientially complete opposites. We can't reason about experience through concepts. They are categorically different. Well, the first part of this little essay question here is, it's a common belief among like theists, for example, that God is creating this universe so that he can learn about himself through the universe, evolving, and then that intelligence and wisdom and consciousness can evolve through, this samsaric phenomena and so forth. That it's God's way of like reaching his full potential or some such. But no, the universe has already been absolutely infinite from just forever. There's no need to grow because it's already infinite. It's already formless. There's no need to grow or develop or any of that. It's it's been there from the very get-go. So, let's see. Then he starts talking about the difference between Hegel's dialectic starts with pure being, and then the antithesis of pure being is pure non-being. And then, according to Hegel, pure being and pure non-being are just undifferentiable. They just merge into each other, and they are synonymous. And that throughout Hegel's dialectic, he just assumes as already like self-evident or proven that pure nothingness and pure just everything, pure infinity are identical, that they are synonyms. Pure being and pure non-being are just synonyms, which does help to explain why the universe appears to be here in the first place, because nothingness and everythingness are synonymous, so to speak. So let's see. The universe is optimizing a function of self-discovery. Now I've already done my best to kick that one in the guts. Let's see. Creating abundant. Yeah. Okay. Self-recursive, intrinsically reflexive, going. Man, let's see. You could argue against Hegel's axiom that one profound difference between pure non-being and pure being, despite them both sharing the aspect that there are no discernible qualities, concluding they are the same, is that eventually pure being possesses the quality of the awareness of everything. Well, that would be a discernible quality, wouldn't it? Pure being possesses the quality of the awareness of everything. Yeah. I'm not so sure. I mean, it's not really pure being at that point. Once it starts getting divided up into parts, then it's not pure being anymore. That's the becoming aspect that is the synthesis of being and non-being. You have to have a contrast. So pure non-being is devoid of any awareness. Well, the pure being would have an awareness that is undifferentiable from non-awareness because there's no discrete thing for it to be aware of. So, yeah, it is kind of a hard topic to wrap your head around, the whole idea of Hegel that pure being and pure non-being are actually the same. Because they're both just formless and just no discernible qualities, no discrete content. So, yeah, the second part. So, I mean, it seems like the main gist of the second half of this question is that pure being really is different from pure non-being. And so that might open the door to the idea of somehow something emerging from pure non-being, this little spark that then gradually over eons and eons is developing into some kind of, I don't know, just getting more and more towards God or cosmic omniscience or something. But still, I think I am inclined to go with the first thesis and antithesis of Hegel's dialectic, which is about the only thing about Hegel that I really like. I don't have much use for most of Hegel's philosophy, but how he begins the dialectic in his logic has definitely made a significant impact on my understanding of the world. So, let's see. Thus, they could be conceptually equivalent in the realm of logic and reason, but experientially complete opposites. But I mean, you can't experience pure non-being, and you can't experience pure being either, because you are not pure being. That you're just sort of a virtual manifestation of pure being, but not really. Man, it's trying to talk about this stuff is so difficult. I mean, even just trying to talk about two different levels of reality at the same time, anything like that, trying to talk about the absolute, which cannot be put into words, cannot be put into perceptions. You can't really think about it in any kind of valid way. But people want to know. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the third, or this is like, this is, I guess we can call this the third question, but he has it as an appendix on the second question. And the title is Appendix on Choosing the Right Path According to the Interpretation of Asymmetry. And so he says, to me, the answer to this question of the second question that he asked bifurcates the path whether one should renounce the world, become a monk, extinction of humanity, or serve the world, have a family, reproduction, evolution of humanity, which could also be the interpretation of, or the assumption of, the asymmetrical universe. Does the asymmetry seek symmetry, equilibrium by becoming nothingness, extinction, nirvana, no awareness, or everything, technological singularity, complete awareness? These could both be interpreted as enlightenment. Well, I mean, we're talking about like recursive self-awareness that is essentially delusional and thinks that it's different from the rest of the universe. And so I guess that's what's being called the asymmetry, or just like karma being out of balance, that karma is always in a state of disequilibrium. And that if you just let karma just seek its own level, like water flowing downhill, it eventually just reach this bliss of everything and nothing. So, which could also be the interpretation or the assumption of the asymmetrical universe. Does the asymmetry seek symmetry, equilibrium by becoming nothingness or everything? Well, I mean, from my point of view, there's really no difference. It's just it's a difference of perception before you get there. So it's sort of like the difference between Buddhism and Hinduism, where, Hinduism is family oriented. I mean, a good Hindu is supposed to go through, the lay person's phase, the householder, what ashrama dharma. There's one of the phases that a good Hindu is supposed to go through is the householder who's married and has kids. And then when he gets older, he renounces the world, becomes like the hermit, and then maybe even goes into the fourth phase, which is the sannyasin, just the wandering renunciant. And so the Hindus, they've reified reality as Brahman, that it is a something. Whereas the Buddhists, they have tried as much as possible to avoid reifying the absolute, which then causes it to become more towards extinction or emptiness or voidness. But ultimately, it's the same thing that they're going for. That a fully enlightened Hindu has reached the same enlightenment as a fully enlightened Buddhist. And the poppy's back, petted more. So, let's see here. I mean, it seems like the assumption is that there's just like there's two absolutes. There's the absolute of everything and the absolute of nothing. And that, you can pick which way you want to go, but I mean, ultimately it's just full circle. And I mean, it winds up the same either way. So I'm a little bit distracted by this dog that's wanting attention. See, I'm just going to have to read this whole question over again. To me, the answer to this question, Q2, bifurcates the path whether one should... the answer that he gave to it, not really the answer that I gave to it, bifurcates the path of whether one should renounce the world, become a monk, extinction of humanity. Well, even the Hindus do that eventually. I mean, that's stages 3 and 4. Or serve the world, have a family, reproductive evolution of humanity, which could also be the interpretation of or the assumption of the asymmetrical universe. Does the asymmetry seek symmetry and equilibrium by becoming nothingness or everything? And I mean, it's the same. I mean, it's just before you get there, the approach may seem different. But once you get there, it's not like an enlightened Buddhist is in a state of just annihilation, whereas an enlightened Hindu is like infinite in all directions. It really doesn't work that way, experientially. So, I mean, just ceasing to exist isn't really enlightenment. Just annihilating yourself would not be considered enlightenment anyway. I mean, that's just extinction. Although there are some people that, even some Hindus that are really sort of biased against Buddhism. They'll say, the Buddhists just want extinction. But, I mean, enlightenment it doesn't mean extinction. Enlightenment means waking up from the illusion. So let's just move on to the next question here. This is from Al Pacino Alpaca, and he says, is Brian alive? And he's referring to our good friend Brian Rue, who went silent for many days after just sort of like convulsively spamming his channels with BitChute videos, because he's not on YouTube. Well, he might be on YouTube around the edges a little bit, but his main social media is BitChute, and he has been uploading recently. So he is still alive. And so I'll just move on to the next question by Al Pacino Alpaca, which is kind of an interesting one, which is as follows. Have you ever drunk your own urine, or do you know anyone who did? Well, any monk who is ordained at his ordination ceremony is admonished that he should content himself with stale urine as his only medicine, which apparently was what ascetics did in ancient northern India in the Buddhist time, that they would just ferment urine and drink it. And the Burmese have interpreted that to mean like cow urine, but probably it was with regard to one's own urine. So anyway, I was kind of curious about this. I was wanting to be like an ancient Indian monk. And so the way the Burmese do it is they take a certain fruit called an emblic myrobalan. I think it's amla in India. And it's one of the world's richest sources of vitamin C, and it tastes like a gooseberry. It's kind of astringent. It tastes bitter at first, and then it has like a sweet aftertaste. It's kind of a strange fruit. It looks like a gooseberry. It's like this big around. And so you take these gooseberries and or emblic myrobalan, and you soak them in cowpea. And strangely, they're like olives, where they start off green, but when you soak them in cowpea, they turn black and they taste like black olives. So monks will eat that as a kind of medicine, kind of tonic. But then I figured, it's like probably in the Buddhist time they were using their own pea. So I did experiment with my own pea. And I should say that the pea also turns black when you put the myrobalan in there. So I was calling it Burmese Pepsi at the time. Kind of a joke there. But I tried it. It's a few sips of it just experimentally. But it didn't seem to be working out right. It was like I had the myrobalan in there and stuff. I was trying to pickle the myrobalan, preserve the myrobalan in my own pea instead of cow pea. And for some reason, it wasn't working very well. My pea wasn't concentrated enough, and it was starting to get like this white, cloudy film on top and everything. So I just threw it out. But I used to know this Indonesian monk who was living in Burma, and he would keep his own pee in a plastic jug, like at least overnight, and then he would wash his head in this stale pee, every morning. And I think he might have rinsed his mouth with it or something too. But it caused the outhouse to just reek so bad that I finally made him stop keeping his jug of pee in the outhouse that we were both using, because it just reeked really awful. But one thing about the whole idea of using pee as a medicine, I have a degree in biology, so I know that your body is getting rid of this stuff because it's literally toxic waste. It's like, it's not good for you to keep it. If you stop being able to pee, you die. So, and it's not just because you blow it up with liquid. It's just that you get, I can't remember what it's called. I can't remember what it's called, but just you get all this toxins in your blood that kills you off. And so I really think that the benefits of drinking pee are very limited. Probably, there might be some benefits. I've had somebody who was into it explain to me that, there's certain chemicals that, your body excretes as a kind of side effect of something else that actually is good for you. But still, most of it is just metabolic waste. So, I experimented with it a little bit, and it's good for pickling emblic myrobalan. At least cow urine is. But I did it for a little bit and then stopped because there didn't seem to be much point to doing it. So I'm just going to move on to Al Pacino Alpaca's next question here. I know it might be a fourth question, but actually it isn't. But please put on screen the name for that suttas that are commentaries on the Atthaka Vagga that are still canonical. Please put a name for it and where to find it. I assume it is in the Khuddaka Nikaya. Yeah, it's in the Khuddaka Nikaya, and it's called the Niddesa. And I don't know if I have a pen here. Put it on the screen. I'm not going to do any of that fancy graphic stuff. Let's see if I can spell it right. There it is. It's on the screen. The Niddesa. I think that's how to spell it. And it's in two books, the Maha and the Chula. The Maha Niddesa is the commentary to the Atthaka Vagga. And the Chula is the commentary to the Parayana Vagga and also to the Rhinoceros Horn Discourse. And I'm not sure if anyone has bothered to translate them into English. So you may have to study up on Pali in order to read the thing, or maybe Thai or Sri Lankan or Sinhalese, I should say, Burmese, where, I mean, any language that actually has been translated into. But yeah, one reason why it hasn't been translated into English is that most English students of Dhamma wouldn't even want to read it, because really it is not profound. It's like the Maha Niddesa, which is the canonical commentary to the Atthakavagga, is trying to comment upon a pre-Theravadan text or a group of texts in such a way as that they are like twisting and contorting it into something orthodox. So when the Buddha says, have no view, then the Mahanidesa will say, well, when he says that, he means don't have any of the wrong views. It's like when it says have no perception, it just means don't have any perception of like ill will, this kind of a thing. But when that's not what it's saying. And obviously, like I was saying recently, and I think it was the previous Q&A, the Buddha wouldn't say don't have wrong views. What is the point of me or the Buddha or anyone else saying, don't believe what's false? Obviously, it goes without saying. Nobody is knowingly going to believe what is false. So, it just becomes like just absurd if you interpret it the way the Atthakavagga does. And actually, or not the Atthakavagga, but the Niddesa. And the Niddesa is relatively late text. It mentions Greeks in it, for example, which is probably a sign of lateness. Talks about Abhidhamma in there, I think, which is also a sign of lateness. So, yeah, I don't think it's any great loss if you haven't read it. I was reading through it just when I was translating the Atthakavagga, just to see what it says. It might help with regard to at least like grammatical construction of sentences and so forth. But, the main purpose of it was really to explain away this well-known body of texts that were so archaic that they were pre-Theravadan and in some respects unorthodox. So they couldn't just edit the Atthakavagga out of the Tipitaka. It was too well known, too important in ancient times. Like the Ashokan edicts refer to at least one or two of the suttas of the Atthakavagga as recommended study. So they had to just change the meaning of it, twist the meaning of it into something orthodox. So here, I'll show it again. Since I went to the trouble of writing it, right there it is, Niddesa. And I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid says, what would you have to say towards those, typically of a neo-pagan type, who accuse Buddhism of being life-denying, as per the Nietzschean understanding of life affirmation, such that they may say that Buddha Dharma originally emerged for lesser or inferior people to cope with slavery? I have run into a fair amount of merit-lacking crypto-materialists who call themselves pagan, typically of a Germanic type, and I always tell them that in the Eddas, Odin achieves something very similar to the Buddha or the Vedic sages when he sacrifices and hangs himself on the world tree. I assume such individuals are basically just narcissists, as they don't have any real religion aside from the worship of provisional qualities like physical strength or wealth. Have you ever run into these kind of socially Darwinist types before? I've come across them on the internet, but I don't think I've ever had like a debate with one in person. So that would be the answer to that last part. But this one part, he says that they may say that Buddha Dharma originally emerged for lesser or inferior people to cope with slavery. That's just absurd. If you read the early texts, that the early Buddhist monks were not lesser or inferior people. They were tough as wood, and they were superior to the average human. They were heavy hitters. So, they were dealing with stuff that most of these neo-pagans could not cope with. Just living alone under a tree in a jungle, just being indifferent to, hunger and thirst and heat and cold and pain and sickness and so forth. They were tough. Like Evola refers to the Buddhist saint as a kind of Superman, essentially like a Nietzschean Superman. So it is true that Buddhism is kind of life denying. It's will denying, like Schopenhauer would teach. And the Hindus accused the Buddhists, even in ancient times, or the Vedists accused the Buddhists in ancient times of being destroyers of life, mainly because the Buddhists were encouraged to become celibate even when they were young. If you were going for enlightenment, if you're going to renounce the world, do it right away and don't even bother with raising a family first, which the Vedic proto-Hindus, they consider that to be wrong. There's got society has to be maintained. So you have kids first and then you renounce the world. So, yeah, some people are just going to be of this world. They're going to be pro samsara. Nietzsche apparently was very pro samsara. And, they just don't want to transcend that. They don't want to get to the ultimate reality, which is beyond samsara. They just think this is it. And so you just prosper as well as you can, which might include, stomping on people who are in your way with your hobnailed jackboots. But let's see. I think I've already addressed. What would you say towards those who accuse Buddhism of being life-denying, as per the Nietzschean understanding of life affirmation? Well, first of all, I'd shoot down any arguments that it was designed for weaklings and inferiors, because that's obviously not the case. So, what would I say to them? That's weird. I've never really stopped to think of what I would say to them. I have said things to them before, I'm pretty sure, but it was just sort of a spontaneous thing. And I'm not spontaneously coming up with anything right now. So they accuse Buddhism of being life-denying. Well, it's more ignorance denying than life denying. It's just that life involves a certain amount of ignorance as a general rule. So, yeah, Buddhism is trying to transcend life, not so much denying it as just going beyond it. And with regard to Nietzsche, I do not consider Nietzsche to have been a particularly wise or happy person, even before he went insane. So, they can accuse away, I guess. They can believe what they like. But at least you should set them straight with regard to any errors of, fact. If they're saying something that's objectively untrue, you can at least set them straight on that. But with regard to matters of opinion, like whether or not Buddhism is life-denying, to some degree, that's just a matter of opinion. In a way they kind of are, and in a way they kind of aren't. And it depends on how you look at it. So, yeah, I think it would just be like a different response to a different person depending on what that neo-pagan type was saying and what he was accusing Buddhism of. So, yeah, I really have not had much interaction with Germanic type pagans, worshippers of Odin and Thor and so forth. I know they're out there, and there's apparently, significant minority of them, but yeah, for some reason we just don't cross paths very much. I'm more inclined to cross paths with people who want a kind of fascistic Buddhism. And I'm not a fascist, but still, some people, that they see, they might be like really hard right and just assuming that like fascism is hard right, which I don't think it is, but still, they just loathe all of the socialist, far left attempts at Buddhism in the West. They see that I'm not swallowing that stuff, and so then they sort of gravitate towards me and are trying to get me to like justify like a militant Buddhism in some sense. And usually I disappoint them because, you can have kind of a militant point of view, but it really doesn't fit in very well with genuine Dhamma. So, Yeah, I think one thing is just people that are ready to, that are striving to know the highest truth may do well to practice Buddhism, but if you want to stay in samsara with your hobnailed jackboots, then you can do that too, and it's really your own choice to make. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is from Alfred. And Alfred says, I have seen a particular monk who was very intelligent. Sadly, he topped himself. He was okay when he got some sort of blood mite disorder, which pushed him to terminate himself. So could this happen to an arahant? So I guess the question is, could an arahant commit suicide? And it does say in the text that the only time a person is justified, I mean, the Buddha says the only time a person is justified in committing suicide is if they have already attained the goal. I mean, you shouldn't kill yourself if you're not enlightened yet, but if you're enlightened, then apparently, at least you'd be justified in that sense. That, I mean, you did what had to be done first, but I can't remember any cases of an arahant killing himself other than somebody like Gautama, who became an arahant while bleeding out after cutting his own throat. So, yeah, I think like you got a fully enlightened being who's got some sort of terminal condition that they're just debilitated, so like somebody like Ajahn Chah, for example, who was like a vegetable for many years before he finally died. In a case like that, if there was an arahant who was moving in that direction, I think it's quite possible that they might just end it early instead of being a vegetable in a wheelchair for 10 years. Or, having a tube up their nose in a hospital bed, being kept alive artificially or something. So, yeah, I don't think that there's anything necessarily prohibitive from an arahant terminating his own metabolic processes. And then, of course, like the Jains and the Ajivikas, they would just deliberately commit suicide by just squatting down in an abandoned area or an isolated area and just not moving until they were dead. So anyways, I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Gaz. And Gaz says, Hail Panyobasa, I think many confuse some of the fatalistic karmic views of the Jains with Buddhism. I myself viewed Kama to be quite all-encompassing until I read the Dita Sutta Anguttara 361, in which the Buddha rejects three sectarian worldviews. Whatever a person experiences, be it good or bad or neutral, is all due to past actions, the plan of a god, or without cause. He then reaffirms his core teachings. He also brings this rebuttal up in further detail to the Jains, specifically in the Dewa Daha Sutta. A few of my assumptions regarding Kama were cleared by this, and also in the Girimananda Sutta, within number 4 of the 10 perceptions of Adinavasanya. It seems to list Kama as just one of many reasons for illness. It makes sense to me that natural disasters, illnesses, even other situations could potentially just be the results of living in the natural world or caused by a supernatural agent, not necessarily due to one's karma, although it is likely as it certainly appears to play a big role. However, regarding all of this, I appreciate the wisdom of the Buddha in discouraging contemplation on the precise working out of karma. I find myself continually impressed by how thorough and wise he was. Ultimately, there is no self, impermanence, and suffering remain regardless of if that suffering is the result of karma, natural or supernatural forces. Is this a correct assessment of things? Okay. Well, towards the top part here, the Dita Sutta, Anguttara 3.61, the Buddha rejects three sectarian worldviews regarding to whatever a person experiences. That it has to be one, due to past actions, which would be sort of more of the karmic point of view. 2, the plan of a god, which would be more of the Muslim point of view. Or 3, without cause, which I don't know if any point of view, I don't know if anyone thinks that everything happens to us at random, which is what without cause would be, I guess. So, I mean, those aren't the only possibilities. Like, for example, with karma, everything that happens to you isn't necessarily due to past actions because you're making karma now. In fact, all of your karma from a Theravadan point of view is present karma because the past no longer exists. The past can have no effect on the present, technically speaking, because it would be a non-existent cause because the past no longer exists based on Orthodox Theravada. So it's like, it's our karma now, which is our will now, is determining what we are experiencing. That would be more my point of view. But also, I mean, in a way, you can interpret Theravada to be that way, that really all karma has to be present karma. And so not everything is due to past actions because, it's due to your present mental states are determining what you're experiencing. And one reason why I come up with that is because I do not consider the material world to be real in an ultimate sense. It's conventionally real, but it's not ultimately real. So saying that natural disasters, illnesses, other situations can cause these things, I consider those to be essentially non-existent causes because it would just be your perceptions of those that would, that's all you can really know. You don't know a natural disaster. You just know your perceptions of a natural disaster, which is in your own mind. And it's like your perceptions are really controlling your samsaric existence. And your perceptions are completely bound up with volition or karma. So it's like you're dreaming your way through samsara in a sense, although there's more law and order in this version of reality than in our sleeping dreams. But we don't need to get into the reasons for that right now. So, yeah, it's Gaz here seems to be assuming, like most Westerners do, that the material world is real and that it exists even if there's nobody perceiving it. And I just don't buy it. And it's in a way, the Buddha was kind of like Immanuel Kant in Western philosophy, where he makes the mind really central to our experience so that, but he kind of, at least in the Theravadan texts, like a physical universe is still accepted as out there, but it becomes almost superfluous because really the mind is number one. And so just as with the Buddha, just as with Kant, many of his successors just became idealists. He was like the founder of the German idealist school of like the 19th century, where they were just rejecting the physical world. It's all just a manifestation of mind because, the physical world was just kind of superfluous. Kant acknowledged you couldn't prove that it exists. He just assumed it was out there in some form. And the Buddha was kind of doing something similar where, he emphasized the importance of mind, but still kind of left open, at least according to the Pali text, the existence of an outward empirical universe that's there even if nobody's observing it. But later schools of Buddhism, like the many Mahayana schools, just abandoned that. It's sort of like they became like the German idealists. So I have digressed, I think, until I need to read this some more in order to get back to the question. He brings this rebuttal up in further detail to the Jains. A few of my assumptions regarding karma were clear. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, it makes sense to me that natural disasters, illnesses, even other situations could potentially just be the results of living in the natural world. Yeah, living in the natural world, which I don't think is real. And probably most Buddhists, at least most Buddhist philosophers don't, because probably most of the Buddhist philosophers are Mahayanists. See, but even in Theravada, that the physical universe, even though it's accepted as out there, it's just radically different from. In a way, it's sort of like science, where science acknowledges there's a material world out there, but I mean, it has very little to do with our perception of it. Our perception of the world is just radically, radically different from the actual reality. So let's see here. Let's see. It'll be a supernatural, not necessarily due to one's karma, although it is likely, as it certainly appears to play a big role. However, regarding all of this, I appreciate this. Ultimately, there is no self, impermanence, suffering remaining, regardless if that suffering is the result of karma, natural or supernatural forces. Is this a correct assessment of things? Well, don't be too sure that the physical universe is real. Don't be too sure that the tree that falls in the forest when nobody's around to hear it even falls at all, that there's even a tree out there if there's no conscious being perceiving it. So, yeah, is it a correct assessment of things? There is ultimately no correct assessment of things. It's going to be, all of it's going to be incorrect, or at least it's going to be invalid. So, I mean, the Buddha was wise when he discouraged even trying to figure out karma. That you can go insane trying to understand karma is what it says in the texts. But the mind is number one. The mind is the forerunner. That everything is mind made. I mean, that's verse number 1 in the Dhammapada. Although again, the Dhammapada is one of those texts where they have to redefine. I mean, at least the first verse of the Dhammapada has to get redefined. So when it says mano pabangama dhamma mano seta mano maya, which means mind is the forerunner of dhammas, and that they have mind as chief, they are mind made. And Buddhaghosa, the commentator, giving the official position of Theravada Buddhism, says that dhammas here means mental states. And then he's turning it into an Abhidhamma depth psychology statement where he's saying that mind is consciousness. Consciousness is the forerunner of mental states, which is untrue. And then he has to say, well, it's not true, but the Buddha said it because of this or that reason. Because consciousness and mental states have to be simultaneous. One doesn't come before the other one. So Dhamma is notoriously difficult to translate because it has so many possible definitions. But here it just means like phenomena or things. I don't think it means just mental states, except to the extent that phenomena or things are really perceptions in our mind, which are mental states. Oh, this is, I mean, I get sort of dizzy trying to talk about this kind of stuff sometimes. Because really with regard to most people probably, I could explain and explain and explain until I'm blue in the face. I'm just exhausted, and still they won't get it, just because, as I mentioned, I think it was the previous Q&A, sometimes you have to be able to think at two different levels simultaneously. Like the conventional and the ultimate, or the conditional and the unconditioned. You have to be able to kind of see things from two different perspectives simultaneously, and I think most people just can't do it. I mean, there are some people that never get to the level of formal operations, just like, for example, just thinking of a statement with regard to its structure or its logical validity. Most people really, or I won't say most people, most children can't think that way. And there are a significant number of adults. I've read that there are actual entire cultures that never get above that level, where you just cannot play devil's advocate. You cannot, for example, argue a position that you do not personally believe. It just makes no sense to you, that you just can't do it psychologically. So how I got to that statement from this question is questionable. Oh yeah, just the difficulty of trying to explain like samsara and its relation to reality, when you have to be thinking at two different levels simultaneously, because samsara is not ultimately real. This phenomenal world we live in is not ultimately real. That it's like a perceptual construct. So I think I'll just move on to scroll way up here. We get Gaz. I'll just move on to Gaz's next question, which is a shorter question. And I think I can actually answer this one. How do views on karma differ between Buddhists and Jains? Which is an interesting question. And for starters, the Jains considered karma to be like a quasi-material substance. It was, in a way, this metaphysical sticky goo that sticks to your soul or your jiva and weighs you down so that your soul doesn't just float up into this heaven of eternal bliss. And so they don't really accept the Buddhist interpretation of karma as essentially volition, a mental state. Like the Jains think that even if you step on a bug accidentally, you're still making bad karma. That it's not just a matter of volition, that you can do something even unknowingly or accidentally, and it still counts as bad karma, which is why Jains will have like a soft grass broom and will be sweeping the ground in front of them as they walk so they won't accidentally step on a bug and then make bad karma, even though they're not trying to step on a bug. And I mean, the Jains are more inclined to think that something completely inadvertent, something completely unconscious is still going to make bad karma, or just karma in general, if you do it, because they do not accept the Buddhist idea that karma is a mental state, that it is will or volition. So also, the Jains believe that the goal is to exhaust your karma. And this is an idea that probably goes back to the prehistoric Indus Valley civilization before the Indo-Aryans ever arrived in India. That there's this idea that you've got this karma that for the Jains is like sticking to their jiva or their soul and weighing it down. So they got to get rid of all their karma, not just the bad karma, but the good karma too. They got to get rid of all karma that's sticking to their soul and weighing it down. Whereas from a Buddhist point of view, even a fully enlightened being, even the Buddha himself, is still going to have residual karma. They're not making any new karma because they've just gone beyond that. But still, like the momentum of past karmic actions is still having an effect on their life and still arising. So those would be some of the main differences between the Buddhist and Jain ideas of karma. And so I'm going to move on to the next question here, which is from Pranav. And Pranav says, have you ever been to India? If yes, where have you traveled? And I did go to India, spent like 3 weeks in India before I came to Burma. I was a monk at a Burmese monastery in California. And then my teacher, or at least he became my teacher eventually, Tongpulu Chaltsin Doya Sayadaw, or also known as Pakoku Sayadaw. He came to America, and then I went back to Burma with him, with his retinue, essentially, because he was kind of a big shot in the Tongpulu tradition. He was probably the most senior and authoritative monk in the Tongpulu tradition after Tongpulu Sayadaw himself passed away. So first we went to Japan, spent like a week or so in Japan. Then we went to Thailand and spent like 10 days in Thailand. And then we went to India, and we went mainly for the Buddhist pilgrimage stuff. So we flew into Calcutta. We rented a Tata minibus, I think it was, or a Matador minibus. And then we just went to the main sites, the main places that the Buddha went to. Except we did not go to Nepal because Tongpulu Sayadaw, or Chaltsin Sayadaw, Pakoku Sayadaw, he had trouble with customs getting into Nepal on a previous trip, so he just decided we'll just avoid. We won't go to Lumbini. We won't go to where the Buddha was allegedly born. But we went to the other main sites. We went to Sarnath, and we went to Bodh Gaya, of course. That was one of the first places we went to. We went to Nalanda University. We stopped off there. We stopped off at Sawati to see, where the Anathapindika's park was and so forth. Yeah, we went to those places. We went to all of the main Buddhist like pilgrimage places. Went to like Vulture Peak, Rajagaha. I tried to find the Black Rock at Isigili Cave, but couldn't find it. So yeah, we just did the main Buddhist pilgrimage thing, and then we came back to Thailand, spent another week there, and then went to Burma. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Mara Made Mahayana, who I'm pretty sure is also Bodhisattva 969. And he says, is that correct? Question mark. But then he continues. He says, the Venerable Luang Pu Lav wrote in his biography, or autobiography, anyone, quote, anyone can practice Vinaya Sutta or Paramatta except for the mad, the feeble-minded, the person whose behavior has sunk below the level of human because they do not have the appropriate conditions to practice. Yes, they are indeed human, but they are fourth-class human. That is why the Supreme Teacher has not allowed the mad, the feeble-minded, the person whose behavior has sunk below the level of human to be ordained. But if this is not known at the time of ordination and they receive ordination and it is discovered after ordination, then they must be expelled, that is, made to be disrobed, because they have not fully attained humanity. And when questioned before the Sangha regarding the obstacles to ordination, they did not correctly answer Manososi, which means, are you a man? Or are you a human being? And they simply answered Amabande, or yes, sir. They did not agree with the truth because they are mad or feeble-minded, unquote. Well, no, I think that the Venerable Ajahn here is mistaken with regard to his understanding of Vinaya. That, let's say a person is feeble-minded or insane, then as a general rule, they won't be ordained. Just like the abbot will know this person really, they don't have the mental wherewithal to follow the Vinaya rules and to understand Dhamma and so forth. So they might just be like an adult novice at the monastery. Every once in a while, you go to a monastery in Burma, there'll be like an adult novice there who usually is like simple-minded, or he's old and sort of like senile or something, or he's just kind of nutty. And, they just don't ordain them as a monk. But if they are ordained, once you're ordained, then you can't just be kicked out again. It just doesn't work that way. There's even a special provision. There was a monk named Gaga in the text who would just have like these psychotic episodes. And he didn't get kicked out. It was just that there's a special provision. If a monk goes really insane and he can't even recall what he did, he's not responsible for his actions. So he can't really break rules. So if a monk goes just totally, has like a psychotic episode, he's just completely out of it. He doesn't recall it afterwards. I mean, he could even like rape a woman or something, I'm pretty sure. And it won't be counted against him, because, it's like pleading insanity in like modern Western law. That, he was not responsible for his actions. He didn't even remember doing it. So then, as the wise guy junior monk, I was thinking, well, what happens if you just get really drunk and black out and just go on a spree? And then you don't remember the next day. Then you're off the hook, except for maybe drinking in the first place. You'd still be responsible for that. So, yeah, you should not ordain the mad or the feeble-minded. And the person whose behavior is sunk below the level of human, they're not even going to want to be ordained anyway, unless maybe they're like a criminal who's hiding from the police and wants to hide out in a monastery. That actually happens, or at least it did happen in Stockton, California, where there were gangs in Stockton, California, including Cambodian gangs. And some of the Cambodian gang members, if the police were hunting them, the police were after them, they would hide out in a monastery. They'd be ordained as monks temporarily. So you'd have Buddhist monks with like hot rods and guns at this monastery, this Cambodian monastery in Stockton. I don't know if it's still that way, but anyways, once you're ordained, nobody can kick you out. The only person that can kick out a monk after he has been ordained is himself, by either disrobing or committing a parajika offense, which gets him excommunicated. The only possible exception to that would be an ordination that was just totally invalid. Let's say you got a trans man who doesn't have a scrotum filled with 2 testicles, who gets ordained as a bhikkhu, then that is not an ordination, because you have to have testicles in order to be ordained as a bhikkhu. So even if they were ordained, they went through the ceremony, they found the politically correct, progressive monks to do it and everything, still they're not ordained as a monk, because they're technically not a man, not biologically. So, I mean, in a case like that, then once it is acknowledged that the person is not biologically male, then, I mean, they're just declared not a monk. They're not kicked out of the Sangha because they were never in it. The ordination just didn't catch traction at all. It just didn't work. But someone who's feeble-minded or nutty, they're having a lucid moment when they're being ordained, and the monks just assume that they're okay, then yeah, they're still a monk. There's no rule saying that if you are, you're like feeble-minded or something. I mean, there's feeble-minded monks in the texts. There's like the dullard. There's a story, I think it's in the commentaries, about there was 2 brothers, and one of them was wise, the other one was just real feeble-minded, but they lived together at the same monastery and everything. And so the dullard just wasn't making much progress, as you might expect. And so the Buddha gave him a special meditation technique, because the Buddha could just look right into you and see, what would work. He could look into you and see what kind of meditation technique would work best for you. So he just gave him a piece of white cloth, this dullard, and he told him, just keep rubbing the cloth. And I can't remember, he was supposed to think something about it being clean or something. I can't remember exactly, but he's just rubbing this cloth. And so there was some sort of formal act of the Sangha, and the dullard was, he's left behind at the monastery, sweeping or whatever. And so he had to be there because all the members of the Sangha have to be present at a formal act. So somebody was sent to go fetch him, but because the dullard had become enlightened and it had attained psychic powers due to this meditation technique, that he had multiplied his body into many, many copies of his own body to get the sweeping done faster. And so the monk comes back, with wide eyes saying, I went to fetch him and there's like 20 of them. So then the Buddha just says, pick one at random and bring him. So, I mean, this is a case, it's from the commentary, but it's orthodox tradition, and it's not in violation of Vinaya, that you can have like a simple-minded monk who is ordained, and he's not kicked out when people realize he's simple-minded or feeble-minded. And then there was Gaga, who was insane, but he wasn't kicked out of the Sangha either. It's the only person that can kick a genuine monk out of the Sangha is that monk himself. So, yeah, just to make a long story even longer, I think the Venerable Ajahn here that is being quoted by Mara Maid Mahayana is just mistaken with regard to his understanding of Vinaya, which doesn't surprise me because Thai monks are not, as a general rule, they're not nearly as much into scholarship as the Burmese. The Burmese, I mean, it's just astonishing. They are phenomenal scholars, a lot of them. They can just quote and quote and quote from texts. They just know it all forwards and backwards. But the Thais, partly because a few hundred years ago, the Burmese sacked the capital city of Thailand, which was Ayodhya at the time, which was the center of their ecclesiastical structure and their ecclesiastical educational system, like the universities and everything. That all collapsed as a result, and it never fully recovered. So that Thai monks will often say things that, I mean, it's just laughable to a Burmese monk or a monk ordained in a Burmese tradition. They're getting the meanings of Pali words completely wrong. For example, like, I think it was Ajahn Lee Damadaro had this little booklet, and an Australian monk gave it to me once to read because he thought it was hilarious, because Ajahn Lee Damadaro, despite being a meditation master, he just didn't know Pali well enough. He's just butchering the Pali, getting the meanings of things wrong and so forth. And in a way, I mean, it goes both ways for Thai monks, because they're not scholars, or a lot of them aren't. They rely more on their own personal experience, which, if they're meditation masters, that can actually be helpful, because the Burmese are just dogmatists. I mean, for them, first and foremost, is what the book says. If your own personal experience doesn't agree with it, your own personal experience is wrong, because the book absolutely has to be 100% correct, even if it's commentary, even if it's sub-commentary. So in that sense, the sacking of Ayodhya was not entirely a bad thing. I mean, had some badness involved in it, especially to the people who were there when it was being sacked. But yeah, the Thais are not nearly as scholarly in their Theravada Buddhism as the Burmese. But that goes both ways, because they're also just less dogmatic. But in this case, I think he just did not understand. He did not understand the subtleties of the rules of monastic discipline with regard to ordination status. But it is true that at your ordination, every monk is asked, Manusosi, which means, are you a man, or are you a human being? And then you say, Amabande, which means, yes, sir. But I mean, just because a person has engaged in depravity or whatever doesn't mean that they're not human. I mean, the original question of asking if you're human or not was to prevent superhuman or supernatural beings, or like shape-shifting cobra dragons, from assuming human form and then being ordained as a monk. But a naga or cobra dragon, they're technically an animal, and they can't become enlightened because of that, according to Orthodox Theravada or just ancient Indian belief at the time. So it's just kind of pointless for them to be ordained into the Sangha. So anyway, I do feel a certain amount of satisfaction that I am able to actually answer certain questions in a way that is fairly straightforward, instead of just engaging in trying to decipher or interpret what the question means, and then get into, just wallow into all these subtleties and so forth, so that when I get to the end of it, I'm not even sure if I've answered the question or not. But I think I answered that one. So then I'm going to move on to Mara Maid Mahayana's second question here. And this is a quote: just as a log from a funeral bonfire, which is glowing at both ends and smeared with excrement in the middle, cannot serve as wood either in the village or in the forest, so I say, monks, is that person who neither works for his own good nor for the good of others. But the person who works for the good of others, not for his own good, is the higher, the better of these two people. And the person who works for his own good, not for the good of others, is the higher, the better of these three people, unquote. So that's a quote from the suttas. And then Mahayana says, isn't that a very clear point for Theravada compared to Mahayana and self-proclaimed warriors of justice? Well, I mean, for a Mahayana Buddhist, I mean, they're not going to care much about what the Theravada Buddhists say, because they're Hinayanists of the deficient vehicle. So, but there is some wisdom in what the Buddha was saying, that, I mean, if you don't help yourself or others, that's just the inferior position. To help others without helping yourself is better than not helping anybody, but still, to help yourself without helping others is superior to helping others without helping yourself. And there is wisdom in that really a person who tries to help others, but they don't cultivate their own wisdom, they don't know how to help others very well, and they often just make things worse. Whereas if you're going to help others, I mean, in order really to help others as much as possible, you have to help yourself as much as possible, because by helping yourself as much as possible, it makes you more able to help others as much as possible. You know, like I was saying earlier, the Buddha, he had helped himself to the extent that he could just look right into another person and see how to help them the best. So, I mean, as a junior monk at the monastery, every morning we had to, or every evening too, we had to recite this statement: by helping others, one helps oneself. By helping oneself, one helps others, which is true. And one of the best ways of helping others isn't just working in a soup kitchen or something. There's nothing at all wrong with working at a soup kitchen and helping people that way. But the best way I have found of helping people is through example. That you're not even trying to help them. You're just, trying to get your own life, in order, cleaning your own room, as Jordan Peterson would say. You're just tending your own garden, as Voltaire would say. And other people observe that and they're inspired by it. Like I was living in a big school monastery near Mandalay, Mahagandhayon, for over a year. And a few times I had monks come up to me, Burmese monks, thanking me, because I went for alms round every day. You didn't have to go for alms round at Mahagandhayon. They had a big dining hall or lunch hall, breakfast hall, and people would come and donate food to the monks every day. So going for alms in the village was completely optional. It wasn't necessary, but I just did it anyway. I just wanted to live on alms food. And some monks were seeing me do that. I had no idea that I was being observed in this way. And then they were inspired by that, because that's the way the ancient Buddhist monks did it. That's the way it says to do it in the text and everything. So they tried it and they really liked it. And then they came and thanked me for it. And there were a few cases where I was instructed to teach, usually Vinaya, because I was one of the most knowledgeable persons with regard to Vinaya at certain monasteries that I was living at. There'd be like some there was a Western teenage boy who was ordained as a novice at Mahagandhayon once. And I was asked, because I spoke English more fluently than anybody else, and I knew Vinaya better than a lot of the people there. It was a school monastery, so there were a lot of people who knew Vinaya there, even though most of them didn't follow it. But anyways, I was asked to teach this German teenage boy about the rules for novices, because he was being ordained as a temporary novice there. And he just obviously wasn't interested. So like you do your best to teach somebody. And I mean, he's just kind of looking around, and he'd rather be somewhere else. He was just doing it because he was told to do it. Or like when I was in California, I was teaching the teenage kids of Burmese immigrants about Dhamma. And again, they were there just because their parents sent them. They weren't really interested. And when I gave the final exam, every single one of them failed the exam. They couldn't even get like the Four Noble Truths right. So trying to help people, it doesn't often work. But helping yourself, trying to help yourself doesn't always work either. So, there's that too. But in order to help others best, you have to help yourself as well as you can. And then it just goes both ways. Helping others helps you. And then helping yourself, it really does help others. Which again reminds me of the saying by St. John of the Cross in one of his books, where he's saying that, you got two people. One person is just feeding the hungry and putting clothes on people dressed in rags and finding homes for homeless people and tending to the sick and just helping people all the time, 24/7, or when they're not asleep or something. And on the other hand, you got a person alone in a cell practicing high contemplation, which would be like jhana from a Buddhist point of view. That he says the person who is helping the world most is the second person who is practicing jhana, because that person, he's not just, attending to the superficialities of, just putting band-aids on wounds, that he's raising the overall consciousness of the world. This is not what St. John of the Cross that's not how he would explain it, but that's how I would explain it, that you're actually raising the level of consciousness in your area and in the world in general, which is helping the world more than, say, just an ordinary normie who's got a good heart, who is, feeding the hungry and so forth. Not that that is bad at all. It's just that getting into superhuman mental states, raising the level of consciousness is more important in the long run, and it is more beneficial in the long run. Also, it kind of reminds me of the Diamond Cutter Sutra, which says that it's the same thing. You got one person who's just, feeding the sick or feeding the hungry and tending to the sick and all that. And you got another person who memorizes just one stanza of the Diamond Cutter Sutra and teaches it to others, that he is actually helping the world more. Because what he's doing is profound. It goes deeper than the first person. But as it says in some Pali text or other, that I can't remember the source of it, by helping others, you help yourself, and by helping yourself, you help others. So, yeah. I mean, some Mahayana Buddhists will say that Theravada Buddhists are selfish and cowardly and so forth. They're just trying to save themselves, but you have to save yourself first. I mean, if you're going to help somebody get out of a burning building, you've got to find the way out first. Otherwise, you're just leading people around in a burning building and none of you get out. But it's better to find the way out, and then, if you're so inclined, come back in and help others to get out, than just stay in the burning building and put dressings on the burn victims. So I think I'll just move on to the next question, because this is turning into another long Q&A. And this is from Skulladin. It's like Aladdin with skull at the beginning. Skulladin. And he says, I was reading a Neem Karoli Baba book, which you had recommended in a previous vid. There was an anecdote about karmic healers and the process of taking on karma. Would you happen to have any experiences with that? And then he says, the only time I've ever heard of that exact process is from the Amish community. And I didn't know the Amish even believed in karma. But it is true that in Ram Dass's books, including the book that he's referring to, which is Miracle of Love, Stories about Neem Karoli Baba, he talks about how some Hindu gurus will take on the karma of their devotees. And they'll do it in various ways. Neem Karoli Baba mainly did it through food. Like one time, Ram Dass gave him a bag of oranges, and Neem Karoli Baba just started stuffing oranges into his mouth. He's just eating all these oranges. And Ram Dass was kind of surprised by this until it was explained to him that he's like processing some of your karmic, like, I don't know, malfunctions or irregularities or something by doing this. And then Ram Dass talks about how there was another famous guru, I think he lived in South India, who did the same thing with cigarettes. People would give him cigarettes and he'd be smoking like 5-6 cigarettes at a time. Just kind of somehow burning through the other person's karma. And that's a Hindu thing. From the Buddhist point of view, it should be impossible. That each person's karma is their own. Kamasako. Everyone's karma is their own. So actually processing somebody else's karma, helping to burn off somebody else's karma. I mean, you could do it through teaching them or through certain experiences that would affect their karma, that would facilitate them working out some kind of karma. But just taking on their karma and running it through your own system, so to speak, that's a Hindu thing, but not a Buddhist thing, not that I've ever heard of. I mean, if any Buddhists do that, Buddhist monk, maybe in Thailand, again, where they're not scholars, a lot of them aren't scholars, and they might think that it's completely legit. Whereas a Buddhist, like a dogmatist scholar monk in Burma would just say, no, you can't do that at all. That's impossible. So the only experiences I have with that is reading about it in books by Ram Dass. So I guess I answered that one, even though it's not a very satisfactory answer. So I'm just going to move on to Skulladin's next question here, which is, in other parts of the book, other than advice, people seem to treat Neem Karoli Baba like some sort of spiritual Bitcoin, very unpredictable, does whatever he wants, but has the ability to raise everyone else's spiritual value just by being around them. And then in parentheses, he's got people's meditation. And then he says, is this cheating, or would it be treated more like technology? Like if someone's short-sighted, they would get fit with glasses, or perhaps something more temporary, like dropping acid to broaden your horizons. So, I mean, he's asking, is it cheating, like spiritual cheating, to get your consciousness raised by being in the presence of an enlightened or extremely wise sage? And no, it's not cheating at all. I don't think so. I mean, how do you cheat spiritually? I mean, any kind of cheating would be invalid. I mean, if it really is making genuine spiritual progress for you, then it's good. You know, it's not cheating. So, I mean, it's not cheating to have your consciousness raised by being in the presence of a person at a much higher level of consciousness. In fact, that's good. And that's like in the Mangala Sutta. It's a list of 38 blessings. Blessing number 1 is avoiding the company of fools. And blessing number 2 is associating with the wise. Because, I mean, mental states are contagious. If you hang out with foolish people, you're going to get foolish mental states through contagion. If you hang out with wise people, you're going to get wise mental states through contagion. And it's just going to lift your consciousness. Like Ram Dass was talking about how people would just go into like deep meditative states in the presence of Neem Karoli Baba. You know, they'd be sitting for darshan. They'd just be, you know, sitting around Neem Karoli Baba. And, you know, there'd be a person in the back just going into this deep trance state, essentially. And Neem Karoli Baba would have people that were called wreckers, who would just go in and just pester the people that were in deep meditative states to get them out of the deep meditative states, because a lot of them just weren't ready for it. Like Ram Dass gives this example of one time he got to visit Maharaji in the evening when all the people had already been sent away, but he had to go there for some reason. And he's sitting there and he wants to get in some meditation. And he just gets into this meditative state where his whole body is just shaking and jerking with like piti, because he's just not used to this deep of meditation. And finally, like Maharaji, Neem Karoli Baba, has to, like, you know, shake him out of it. Like one time, Ram Dass was going into this deep meditative state, and then Neem Karoli Baba, who of course knew what the mental states of the people around him were like, he would just like keep interrupting him. You know, he'd keep interfering with his meditation by just asking him, you know, how much money does so and so make? You know, just these dumb worldly questions to bring him out of these meditative states, because, you know, it's like he wasn't ready for it or something. And Neem Karoli Baba knew this. So, yeah, it's not cheating. Just to have your consciousness raised by being in the presence of a wise person is actually highly advised in the texts. That's actually something you should be trying to do. So, yeah. All right, so then I'm going to go on to Skoladin's next question here. I've heard of people dream journaling in an effort to reinforce their consciousness so that they could achieve lucid dreaming. Is there any technique for sleep meditation? And then he says, I'd assume it would need a different method since it would be a lower state of consciousness than basic meditation deals with. And I mean, I've heard a lot about lucid dreaming, but I haven't really heard much, if anything, about meditating in your dreams. And I assume that's what he's referring to, that you train yourself to lucid dream so that you can continue meditating in your dreams at night. And I assume it's been done. I mean, I've kind of done that in dreams, just haphazardly, you know, not a lucid dream, but just in a dream, I've been meditating. So yeah, I mean, what happens in dreams is really a kind of gray area according to like Theravada Buddhist philosophy. Like, let's say you kill somebody in a dream. I mean, are you making bad karma for doing that? I assume there would be a little bit of like dreamy, wispy kind of karma involved, but it certainly wouldn't be as bad as actually killing somebody. Like, you know, in the bigger, more like higher level dream that we're in now. So, yeah, I mean, lucid dreaming, I'm not sure what the actual advantages are of lucid dreaming, although it does seem that being an enlightened being in this samsaric world is like being a lucid dreamer, whereas most of us are just, you know, just in the dream and thinking that it's real. So is there any technique for sleep meditation? I assume you would first cultivate lucid dreaming and then have the intention of just sitting down to meditate in your dream. I mean, that's, I assume, how you do it. And I assume you do it pretty much as the same as when you're awake. I mean, if you're good at doing anapana, you usually do anapana, just mindfulness of breathing, then you do that in the lucid dream too, I suppose. It might be easier to get psychic powers from meditation in your dreams. You might be able to fly easier, that kind of thing. So, well, that's kind of weird. There's a water. I wonder how that happened. There's a flower pot rolling around just right outside the window. Maybe the wind did it. Anyways, so I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Newman. And this is turning into a long one. I knew this was going to be a long one. And Newman says, what do you think of Platonism and its similarities to Advaita, Vedanta, essentialist Eastern metaphysical traditions? And with regard to Platonism, I mean, first of all, you've got the original Platonism, which is the teachings of Plato. And I've read most of Plato's dialogues. And I really am not impressed by Plato, at least as he is represented in the Socratic dialogues. Yeah, I don't think he went nearly far enough. But then you've got Neoplatonism, which came after. And I mean, I've read that Platonism just went through phases. Like shortly after Plato died, that his academy, I think it was called the Academy, the place that he was teaching, and if I'm not confusing him with Aristotle, that there was like a period where it was like hardcore skeptics had pretty much taken over Plato's school. And then after that, you got into Neoplatonism, like with Plotinus and what was it, Porphyry, I think. So I assume that I mean, it's the Neoplatonism of somebody like Plotinus that comes much closer to Vedanta than the actual teachings of Platonism, of Plato, I mean. But I mean, they're very similar. I mean, you've got like the highest truth, the good in like the philosophy of Plotinus, and like Brahman in like Vedanta. And then like one stage below that, you've sort of got the demiurge. You know, you've got like the force that is just dividing up this infinite potential into various manifestations. And that would be like Maya in Hinduism or Vedanta. I'm not sure if there's much emphasis. I really like in some Hinduism, you've got Brahma as the personification of ultimate reality. He's like the creator God in a sense. And his consort is Maya, who actually is the one who's like the creator God, because Maya is the one who's just spinning off the phenomenal universe. And then below that, you've got another level of the rolling flower pots distracting me. You've got just the level of, you know, all the various beings, the 10,000 things that the Tao Te Ching talks about. So, I mean, in that sense, it's very similar. There's a lot of parallelism. And it could be that Plotinus was actually influenced by Indian philosophy. There is some evidence supporting that. So, or it could just be that it was just independently discovered, you know, in India and in wherever Plotinus was when he was coming up with this stuff, or whoever was teaching him. But there were some philosophers who had been to India, had studied some Indian philosophy, and then came back to like the Roman Empire, Greece and the Roman Empire. So, I mean, there could have been some influence, like Vedic influence, on some of like Western classical mysticism, because Plotinus is essentially a mystic, and somebody like Shankara, who was one of the main teachers of Vedanta, also was a mystic. And so their own like meditative experiences are probably going to be fairly similar. You know, the higher up you go spiritually, the more similar the experiences become. And down at the bottom of the level of dogma, you know, it can be radically different. But the higher up you go, the more they converge. So it may be just a combination of just empirical self-discovery, so to speak, in two different places, and also a certain amount of borrowing of ideas, or just like exchange of ideas, especially from east to west. So let's see. Yeah, so I do think that they are very similar, although with regard to the lower things, like Neoplatonism got very much into like talk about like the different levels of archons and so forth, that the I'm pretty sure Vedic pantheon really didn't go into that much detail, or didn't go about it in the same way. But the more high up you go, the more they become similar. So I guess I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Tig, and Tig says, can I get a Roman salute? And I assume he can. I mean, I don't know what's preventing him from getting a Roman salute. The thing with me is that, I mean, the farthest I really am willing to go is a Romulan salute, which is like this. You know, first you got to thump the chest. I mean, even Captain Kirk did this on an old episode of Star Trek, where the Romulans, when they would salute, they'd go like this with the chest and then extend the arm. But a real Roman salute really comes too close to the Olympic salute, which is racist and sexist and above all ableist. Because the Olympics, I mean, they only give medals to people who are physically fit, as a general rule. And that's just ableism. That's just rank ableism. And so I won't do the Olympic salute, which is the same as the Roman salute. But the Romulan salute I can do. But also, right below, Tig asked if he could get a Roman salute. Lieberlam also said, is it true that we can get a Roman salute with a bicep flex with the other arm? And theoretically, that is you could probably get that. But the Roman salute, it's just too similar. I mean, it's essentially the same as the Olympic salute. And the Olympic salute is racist and sexist and ableist. So we can't do that on this show. And so finally, I'm going to move on to the very last question. The very last one. After about 2.5 hours of rambling away. And this is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, I'm curious as to what convinced you about karma. Why do you feel it a certain reality or true? And as I was saying, well over an hour ago, I really don't consider anything to be a certain reality, especially at the perceptual level. Because, I mean, there's always a certain amount of uncertainty involved, and just the limitations of perception as a tool to actually understanding reality. But so I don't consider karma to be just absolutely certain. I mean, I'm just not sitting here telling you just like as an authority, I know that karma is real, and if you do this, then you're going to have certain consequences and so forth, that it is a fact. No, I really don't swing that way. I mean, for starters, certain aspects of karma are just obvious. If karma is volition, as Buddhism says it is, if karma is will, then if there is will, then there is karma, because they are synonyms. Also, I think it was the last Q&A, I'm talking about how one manifestation of karma that even the average materialist cannot deny is that karma is like the automatic pilot. It's just the force of habit that gets us through life so that we don't have to wake up all the way. You just get into this habit of doing a certain thing. It might not even make you particularly happy, it might make you miserable, but it's gotten you through life thus far, and so it just becomes this habit that you just don't change, and we're governed by habit. And then, I mean, you don't have to be fully awake. It's just the habit takes over and runs it for you, and you can be like in a semi-stupor going through life much of the time, just sort of acting on knee-jerk reflex, just the force of habit. And that is a manifestation of karma. But with regard to deeper metaphysical aspects of karma. One of the main reasons why I accept karma as a working hypothesis is that I do not believe that this physical world really exists, that it is a manifestation of mind, of mental states, of perceptions. And so, I mean, if this physical world isn't existing, then, I mean, what is causing the stability of our perceptions? And that would be karma also. And I've read so much, like Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass, and many other books. Those are like, I began with Ram Dass books. I had a youth counselor give me Ram Dass books to read when I was like 16, 17 years old. 17, I think. And I just intuitively accepted it. These people obviously knew better than I did. And it was like, yeah, it's just intuitively, I could accept it wholeheartedly, even if I didn't understand it yet. Like a lot of things I've accepted just intuitively, like this world is an illusion. I mean, I accepted that and just enthusiastically accepted it long before I could really begin to grasp it. It just felt true. It just intuitively, it just struck a chord, and it was like, yes. It was just this feeling of, that's it. And karma just helps to explain, why this universe is the way it is. In a sense that, I mean, I cannot fall back on materialism because I just cannot accept materialism. So that would be, I mean, I'm not 100% absolutely convinced about anything. That's just it. I mean, perception is delusion anyway, or illusion at best. So anything that's in this samsaric world is going to be illusory to some degree. And that would include karma also. That would include Dhamma, at least everything below the ultimate level of it. So I accept it as a working hypothesis, just like I accept the enlightenment of the Buddha as a working hypothesis, or at least the extreme wisdom of the Buddha. So, yeah, I'm not 100% convinced at a perceptual level of really much of anything, or I don't consider anything to be a certain reality, because, and if there is a certain reality, it's beyond the level of like perceiving it. All we can deal with is just perceptions, which are just symbols and illusory besides. So I don't know how satisfactorily I answered that one, but I did answer it, and that was the last one. And so I'm going to put on this fez again because I said I was going to. Man, trying to get it on right is kind of tricky when you don't have a mirror. There you go, I guess. So you know the drill. If you got any questions about anything you think I can answer, economics is not on the list of things that I'm good at answering. So economics questions, it's a long shot that I'll be able to answer it. But if you got any questions about Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, karma, meditation, Burma, monasticism, that sort of thing, just about me personally, I'm generally pretty good at answering questions about myself personally, because I've got some experience with myself personally. Then just ask them in the questions below. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. If you have access to my Subscribestar account, you can ask them there. And like and subscribe. And if there's still no URL links underneath this video, because YouTube banned me for like 2 months from putting URL links because I was too forthright in answering a certain question on a certain forbidden subject, then you can find my URL links under my videos on BitChute or Rumble, which you might be watching this now on BitChute or Rumble, and good for you, because YouTube is it's really not ideal, and it's one of the purposes of YouTube is to promulgate a certain globalist narrative that is pretty much largely hogwash. So I guess that's it. And so in addition to all that, I will just say be happy. And then I'll push this stop recording button twice, I think.